Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Redmond and welcome to Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we discuss everything to do with theology books that might be on a reading list for a seminary course, for a bachelor's or master's degree in theology or in biblical studies, or simply books that might have piqued your interest. Maybe you've seen them in your own pastor's library or in your own vicar's office, or perhaps even on a bookshelf somewhere. Well, we're going to talk about a number of them today. If you like what we have to say, please leave us a thumbs up on YouTube and remember to subscribe and to click on the bell, and that way you'll know whenever we release another episode. So today I want to talk about my favourite commentaries on the book of Esther, a different Old Testament book for many reasons. Looks largely like it's there to establish the reasons for the Feast of Purim, which was instituted a long time after the Torah was written. And at the moment, we're in a time when there are a couple of really serious volumes that are not out yet. For example, we do not have a new international commentary on the Old Testament, the book of Esther. Now that leaves a big hole. There are others too that are currently lacking or awaiting updates. So some of these, ones that maybe I might not have shown you, but what I would say today is all of my commentaries, and of course I am only talking about the ones that I personally own, all of them have really got something to offer on the book of Esther. And whereas I've got a handful at the end, which are the outstanding ones, maybe the more technical ones, but all the same, all of these have got a considerable amount of value to me. Now, what I want to start with is reading the Megillot, a literary and theological commentary by Jeanette Matthews. This was published in 2022. Only 46 pages are about Esther, because as this is the whole of the Megillot, you have got Song of Songs, you've got Ruth, you've got Ecclesiastes, you've got Lamentations, as well as Esther. Now, this book lays out Esther as if it was a play, and it also says on page 257 that this is the only book in the Bible that you can truly describe as a comedy, although it says, well, when it's describing it as a comedy, it's really talking about irony. Now, I would suggest that this is a little bit lacking in the traditional thoughts of a commentary. There are whole sections, really, where it doesn't say a lot, but it definitely gets you to think about the text in a different way because of the way it's laid out. And it also does look a little bit into the theology of all the books in here, and it has a decent bibliography. So this has some value. I definitely wouldn't be without it, but is it a big deal? Probably not. The Tyndale Old Testament commentary by Deborah Reed, this came out in 2008, and this is on Esther alone, and it's 168 pages. So frankly, this offers quite a lot. Now, in general, where there's anything to be said, I'm going to be talking about chapter 4 in the section where Esther and Mordecai are debating, and you come to that wonderful expression of, perhaps you have been called for a time such as this. Well, Deborah Reed, I think, has really got something to offer here. I think the Tyndale Old Testament commentaries can be very hit and miss, and I think this one, to my mind, is a hit. And she says that God will raise up someone else, but the omission of any reference to God means that we have to add to this text the theological perspective. Richard Borkham makes this comment: Mordecai does not mean that if Esther does not do something, God will. He means that deliverance for the Jews will occur somehow, whether through Esther's actions or some other means. His who knows whether is not scepticism, but nor has it the confidence of prophecy. It is a hopeful working hypothesis. She goes on to say, the author seems to be at pains to refrain from mentioning God in this most important of all Mordecai's speeches, it is arguably more difficult to keep God out of here than to include him, but the latter would conflict with the author's overriding purpose. What is clear that Mordecai's speech is inspirational and effective. Mordecai underestimates neither the severity of Esther's predicament nor the saving qualities of her potential. I think that's a great summary of the situation. This is not an expensive commentary, and it's 2008, still very readable, very quotable. Now, one that I'm always fond of, the New Interpreter's Bible. This is volume 3. It's got 1 or 2 Kings, 1 or 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Tobit, and Judith. So a couple of apocryphal books in there. This was published in 1999, and it's got 117 pages on Esther, and the section on Esther is written by Sidney White Crawford. Now, what I would say about this is, these books are expensive, but when you look at the number of commentaries in the book, then they actually work out very competitive. And this has a decent number of pages on Esther. These are big pages, although the fonts are quite good as well. But let me just give you an example here of what Sidney has to say. She says, many biblical leaders, for example Moses in Exodus 4, Barak in Judges 4, and Jeremiah in Jeremiah 1, all male, attempted to excuse themselves when called upon for drastic action on behalf of the Jews. The author all but abandons the presence of the go-between to emphasize the importance and intensity of this dialogue. Mordecai is not prepared to excuse Esther so easily. He takes a severe tone, first reminding her that she is Jewish and that the decree applies to her as well. She is not safe in the palace, for it is from the palace that the danger emanates. I think you'd find that Sidney White Crawford has lots of other good things to say, and it's definitely a worthwhile commentary. Although my version was printed in 1999, I'm not sure if there's been any updates, but I'm suspicious that that is getting old. Now, the Abingdon Press commentaries, the Abingdon Old Testament commentaries, I have found in general to be quite dependable. This one on Esther is by Linda Day. It was published in 2005, and it's a healthy 177 pages. And I actually found this quite accessible. I found that I would start to read it in sections, but I found myself just being absorbed and flowing along through the book. This is quite an easy one to actually read, and most commentaries are not easily read, I would suggest. They are easily consulted, but this one is very accessible indeed. Just before we get to the main comment, there is just one other comment here I wanted to highlight. Linda says, Vashti, though a key player, is not heard throughout this entire episode. The narrative reports merely that Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. Nor is there any explanation given as to why Vashti does not come at her husband's request, though interpreters have surmised a variety of possibilities. She is to wear only her crown and nothing else, which is according to the Megillah and the Targums. Only concubines are to attend men's parties, according to Greek beliefs about Persian customs, or her dignity will not permit her to parade herself before drunken men. In a sense, if that is true, then Vashti is actually being represented as a woman who stands up for herself and won't just be paraded about like a toy. And I think that a lot of the commentaries would echo that. But I think Linda Day is probably the best at explaining what she means on that one. But going back to chapter 4, it says this: Esther and Mordecai have shifted places. Instead of his trying to command her, she now commands him, and he obeys fully and without question. This is verse 17. Her relationship with her foster father has changed. During this scene, Esther's persona shifts to that of a commanding presence in the kingdom. Servants play an important role in this episode, for they are the ones who make the exchange between Mordecai and Esther possible. They continually shuttle back and forth between the palace interior and outside the palace gate. And then she lists the various servants. Now, I would suggest that's a very good point. I would also suggest that the way she attacks that is probably a little bit different to any of the other ones that I've read. I think this is an extremely good commentary. Now, this is the Asia Bible commentary, and I've referred to one or two of these others in the past. This one by Esther is by Peter H.W. Lau. So Peter Lau published this in 2018. This is part of the Langham Global Library, and it's 131 pages. And I would say to you that this is particularly refreshing. The Asia Bible commentary, I think sometimes are a bit hit and miss. This one for me is definitely a hit. And if I had to summarise it in one word, it would be, this is refreshing. On page 53, it has this to say. It says, some commentators hear a note of resignation to fate in Esther's next statement. And if I perish, I perish. Yet coming straight after her instruction to fast, to seek God's favour, it is better to hear a note of courageous determination in her voice. Perhaps it is similar to the Filipino phrase, bahala na, which means something like let it be. Bahala is derived from an old Tagalog name for God, Bathala. So it is like saying God will take care of it. This is a similar sentiment to Daniel's friends as they faced annihilation. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. So here Lau is making a real connection between the text of Daniel and the text of Esther. And in a sort of a final comment on the interaction between Mordecai and Esther over this issue, he says this: so as the chapter ends, we see that both Esther and Haman have laid plans. Esther's table was set for feasting, Haman's pole was erected for lynching. However, within God's plan, whose plan would be successful? And then he goes on to this wonderful section on Esther and politics. For a 2018 commentary, I think this definitely adds something to the literature, and I heartily recommend it to you. Now, a series which I sometimes think I've always read the wrong volumes in the interpretation series. This one is by Carol Bechtel, published in 2012, and 101 pages on the Book of Esther. And I think this one is actually really good. I think this offers a lot. And whereas interpretation is looked upon as mainly being a commentary for preachers, don't misunderstand this. This says a lot about Esther. And regarding the section that we've been looking at, it says her reply is revealing in several ways. First, it is saturated with humility and piety. She does not assume that she is going to accomplish the mission single-handedly. Contrast this with Haman in 3 verse 7, who is so confident he goes ahead and sets the date for the Jews' destruction, even before he asks Xerxes. Her reference to fasting acknowledges that she is relying on others, and perhaps God, though the reference is oblique for success. Second, her words demonstrate uncommon bravery. I think Bechtel has a lot to offer, and again, this is a very inexpensive commentary, and if you're looking for something to read about it, it should be on your list. Now, we've got some other ones here. Two of them here that are very interesting are the New Beacon Bible commentary. This is on Ruth, Song of Songs and Esther, and the Esther section is written by Elaine Bernius. This was published in 2020, and it has 99 pages on Esther. Now, I'm a big fan of this series, but I have to say, I think it's a shame they've rolled all 3 books into one here. I think it would have been interesting if they'd given us a book on Esther by itself. But anyway, the 99 pages offer something that is definitely worth having. The verb translated to beg for mercy in this section is built on the same root used to describe the favour Esther has received from others. The same verbal form is translated by the NIV to beg for favour in Hosea 12 verse 4 and is used multiple times in Solomon's prayer of dedication for the temple in both Kings and Chronicles. It gives the references. In that context specifically, it is often correlated with prayer and translated to supplicate, with an emphasis on a pleading for mercy and a return to favour with the Lord after Israel's sin. Though the sin in this case does not lie with the Jews, the need for mercy and a return to the king's favour is desperate. I thought that was an aside that I hadn't read anywhere else, and I thought it was definitely an excellent contribution to the literature. Now, the Story of God Bible commentaries have not been going very long. This one was published in 2020, but my shelf is getting narrower as there are quite a lot out now. 5, 10, 13. Looks like 13, 14 of the Old Testament, 3, 6, 9, 12, 13. 13, 14 of the New Testament. So they are getting the volumes out, and a lot of them have got very, very good authors. So I would suggest to you this really is a very good commentary, and one that adds an awful lot to the story of God. What it has here in chapter 4 is it says, Esther's final words, "If I perish, I perish," echo the words of her forefather Jacob, who pragmatically declared, "As for me, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved," after praying that God would grant his sons mercy before Joseph, so they would all return from Egypt. Esther now embraces a call that is fraught with danger, a call that will enable her to fully discover herself and embrace her full identity as both Jew and Persian queen. Esther stands with both Vashti and Mordecai in their disobedience to the king's orders and rises above the intent of the royal edict that mandates the husband's rule over the households. And I felt that Marion Taylor has a lot to offer there, and this is, at 164 pages, a very worthwhile introduction to the literature Esther. Now, I've shown you a couple of these recently. These are the JPS Bible commentaries. They're printed backwards. I don't mean the letters are printed backwards, but the pages are. And this one on Esther is by Adele Berlin, published in 2001, 110 pages. And Berlin actually also suggests that Esther is a comedy and should be recognised as such. And I think that he does have some decent arguments for that. But he says about Vashti, when she was kicked out as being queen, he says Vashti's actions, a separate party for the women, her refusal to appear before the men, established the standard for sexual behaviour at court, which is violated by the king, overreacted to by his courtiers, and used by Esther for her own ends. The scene introduces the tone of bawdiness, which continues throughout the story and is a feature of its farcical nature. More important, it paves the way for Esther's entrance into the story and into the court. Without Vashti there would be no Esther. Vashti's point of view is never given. She does not speak, not because the author silenced her, but because the plot requires that we see her only through the eyes of men. Her absence, both her voluntary and her involuntary absence, is the most powerful aspect of her characterisation. I think in that respect Berlin has a lot to offer. When it comes to the really famous section in chapter 4, I honestly thought he didn't say anything new. In fact, he didn't really say a lot. And what I would say is, I've really recommended a few of these JPS commentaries, particularly the one on Numbers, I seem to remember, and I liked the one on Ruth. But this one, I don't think if I was trying to be cautious with my money that I would have bought this again. But it definitely is worth the read. I got a lot from it overall, but I don't really think it offers much that's outstanding, except perhaps what I just read to you about Vashti. Now, a couple more here. The Anchor Yale Bible, Esther, is by Carey A. Moore. In fact, an awful lot of them are by Carey A. Moore. I don't know how many he's written, but I know I've got 3 or 4. But this was published in 1971, then reissued in 2011. I don't actually think it's been updated, but mine was published in 2011. I think that this book is probably one that they feel still has something to say, and by putting it out at a new date, it makes it more quotable. So Carey Moore in general, I think, is a good commentator, and he does have something to contribute. Now, you remember that Mordecai says to Esther, you and your family will not be saved if you don't do anything right now. What Moore says is, whether out of fear of God's punishment or Jewish reprisals against her, Esther finally agreed to go to the king unsummoned, saying, if I perish, I perish. Her words have been variously interpreted, ranging from very flattering views, such as Barthes, where Esther is a selfless and courageous free will offering, to something much less than that, a despairing expression of resignation to the inevitable. And if you go back in a few pages, you will see a little bit more explanation of what he might mean by Jewish reprisals against her. I didn't read that exact phrase anywhere else, and I thought it had something really to offer in its 118 pages. So getting a bit past the point of quotation, but with the new print date on it, maybe you can get away with that. I think that would probably depend on your tutor. So this is the Old Testament Library, Esther, by John Levinson, published in 1997. Again, this is getting a bit borderline for age, but it's still within the 30 years. This is 142 pages. And again, there is definitely a lot of worthwhile reading here. I would suggest to you this is a very good commentary. Talking about Esther chapter 4, he says Esther 4 verse 5 highlights another contrast between Mordecai and Esther. His knowledge versus ignorance. The royal eunuch Hathach finds Mordecai in the city square, a place often associated with rites of lamentation. There Mordecai tells him all that had happened to him, perhaps signalling the Jews' acknowledgement that he was the cause of the impending catastrophe. I think that the interesting thing to me is that he's comparing knowledge versus ignorance, and this is an example of why the OTL has a lot to offer to us. Now, I'm now going to show you what I think are my top 4 commentaries on the Book of Esther. This one by Andrew Steinman is the Christian Standard Commentary on Esther. Christian Standard Commentary is what used to be the New American Commentary. They've gone from a red sleeve to a blue sleeve. This was published in 2024. It's 192 pages. It's got a good bibliography, partly because it's so fresh, and as well as the indexes are helpful. I would say to you that this is definitely a cut above most of what we've looked at. What Steinman has to say that's a little bit unique about chapter 4 is he talks about royal clothing. So what he actually says on the page is, finally Mordecai said Esther had come to her royal position for just this purpose. This word is also used to describe her royal clothing, marking her as the queen. In her regal attire, Esther will be admitted by Ahasuerus into his presence. Later, Mordecai will be dressed in royal clothing, and he too would come to his position for such a time as this. I think what's really interesting here is connecting royal clothing with the telling of the story. He is making connections that are not seen everywhere, And I would suggest to you that Andrew Steinman is a very good person to read on the book of Esther. Now, my top three: the NIVAC, the New International Version Application Commentary by Karen Jobes. Now, Karen Jobes is a real strong theologian. She has so much to offer. This was published, though, in 1999, but it's 248 pages. And like all the NIVACs, every section ends with an application for today, and not many commentaries do that. And so this is a series that is favoured by preachers, and I would suggest this might still be the top choice for preachers to buy for a commentary on the book of Esther. What Jobes does here, she talks about in chapter 4, who is the main character in the story. You might say, well, isn't it obvious? The name's on the book. She says the question of whether Mordecai or Esther is the main character has been debated. And she goes through a few points to that. And she says this: Esther's decision to go to the king begins a role reversal with Mordecai. Although he continues to play a prominent role in the story, it is only because Esther facilitates his involvement. It is Esther, not Mordecai, who plans the strategy to unmask Haman and prevent the genocide. It is Esther, not Mordecai, who finally has to courageously face the king. Furthermore, although it is not known that the author of the book has signed its name, the book is, after all, called Esther, not Mordecai. Someone must therefore have considered Esther to be the main character. Given that Esther is the main character of the story, the author invites his readers to reflect on her character development, comparing it perhaps with our own. I think Karen Jobes has an awful lot to interest you and engage with you, and I think this will remain one of the top commentaries that's out there. Now, I'm not quite sure whether this is my top or my second, but I'm putting it in second for now. This is by Frederick Bush. It's the Word Biblical Commentary. It was published in 1996, but then this was reissued in 2018 with 3 additional pages. Wow, watch for those 3 additional pages. They really add value. I'm being slightly cynical here. But at 244 pages for Esther, in a book which also gives you Ruth, and this is about 512 pages in total. This gives you perhaps the most technical commentary on Esther that I have found personally. And I think it's a great one to always reverse to and look back on. I think this is a classic commentary, I really do. So, looking at some verse that we've already looked at in another one, Esther's reply is one of firm conviction. Her final words, "If I perish, I perish," are not a despairing expression of resignation to the inevitable, but courageous determination. Responsibility for progress in the resolution of the crisis of our story has now been devolved upon her. Hope for the Jews' deliverance from annihilation at the hands of Haman and his edict have emerged. It may seem indeed a tenuous hope, lying as it does in the hands of a queen who is currently out of favour and one whose life hitherto has been devoted to beauty treatments and the royal bed. He elsewhere talks about it's been 30 days since she has been called to the king, which suggests it's been 30 days since she slept with the king, which also suggests perhaps she's a little bit out of favour, which may have had something to do with her reticence initially to see the king. But she's still got the looks, people. I've put this as my first. It's either my first or my second. But this is a commentary from 2016. It's part of the Evangelical Exegetical Commentary. It's got 392 pages on Esther, and it's Andrew Tomasino is the author. Now, I have to say to you, this is a series which in general is good, but one or two of them I've not really been in love with. But this is a brilliant commentary. I think sets a new standard for commentaries on Esther in our day. And as this was published less than 10 years ago, it's got a good up-to-date bibliography. I think it has an awful lot to offer. And I've not read Tomasino on anything else, but he gets some very good reviews, particularly by John H. Walton, Professor of Old Testament, and Bill Arnold, Professor of Old Testament at Asbury. So what has he got to say here in Esther chapter 4? He says, Esther's final words have often been taken as a sign of resolve or courage, but may be better understood as sarcasm. She states once again that the action she is about to take is illegal. Mordecai and the audience knows this fact already. It has been part of the whole exchange. The repetition can only be intended to drive home the fact to Mordecai that he is forcing Esther to become a lawbreaker, just as Mordecai himself was in his refusal to obey the king's command regarding Haman. I think Tomasino has lots of little insights dotted around this commentary that you may not read anywhere else. I would think you'd probably see most of them in Bush, but there are certainly things that even Bush doesn't pick out. This isn't as technical as Bush. This is much more accessible, particularly for pastors, but I would suggest to you this is a great commentary. And if you wanted, just to buy a couple of top-notch commentaries on Esther today, I would go for Tomasino and Bush. If you're a pastor, I would particularly go for Job's. And I would suggest that the new one in the Christian Standard Bible is also the other one to consider. But all the commentaries I've offered to you today, I think have really got something to offer. I can't say that any of them are worthless. I think they're all really good. But the last few there, those last four, my real top recommendations if you wanted to do a full study on Esther. And I would say to you, Esther is a book that has a lot of insight into the dealings of God with the people of God, and you will find something in it that is helpful to you. So I hope that has been a help. If it has, remember the thumbs up. Remember to subscribe if you haven't done already. Remember to click on the bell. I do hope that you will be able to find time to comment below, because I try to find time to comment back to you. And do remember that this channel only survives by your support. So thank you for watching to the end. And God bless you. Until next time, all I need to say to you is bye.